Hey fearsome friends, it's time for more creepy encounters from me, Miss Fearsome. From scary old women, potential axe murderers, and road rage gone wrong. Get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. So I lived in a normal suburban neighborhood with mostly middle-class residents, and there was a small Catholic school that I attended because it was only a 5-minute walk away from my house. I was in 4th grade and there were 3 designated recess areas for us kids to play in. One of them was for grades 1 to 3, the other 4 to 6, and the last area 7 to 8. My friends and I would frequently walk across the schoolyard to the 7th and 8th grade area because we thought it was cool not to follow directions. We'd go right up to the end of the school property line before getting yelled at to go back to our area by a teacher on recess duty, and we did this every day so we could play Pokemon and play fight each other like boys do. Well, one day all of my friends had gone on a school trip. I think it was for track and field, so I was alone. It was lunchtime recess, which was 40 minutes long, so I had a lot of time to kill. I wandered around the schoolyard for a bit until I decided to go to the edge of the fence where I'd usually be with my friends, and sat down underneath a pine tree and just looked at the other kids playing. I was sat there for a while until I heard a voice from behind me. It was raspy as he said, Hey kid," and he appeared seemingly out of nowhere. There was a small 4-foot fence between me and the guy, so I felt relatively safe, but he looked very old and dirty. He was wearing unfashionable clothes and was clean-shaven, but wasn't very tall, so didn't seem threatening to me at all. He was staggering towards me as he just struck up a conversation with a 4th grader, like it was nothing. He asked if I could help him out by giving him a few quarters, but obviously I didn't have any as I was a kid with no money. He then leaned on the fence and just started asking me what I wanted to do in life. What was my dream job? How old was I? And whether I went to the school behind me or not. Stupidly, I told him the truth, and I guess it was because I genuinely didn't feel threatened by him, but I happily told him I was 9 and that I went to this school. He asked my name and I told him that too. Then eventually he straight up asked me if I could ask my parents if he could crash on my porch for the night. I guess something switched in my brain then, because after that question I immediately felt overwhelmingly scared. I told him I would ask my parents, at which point I walked away and told one of the teachers supervising about this weird man asking to stay at my house. Instantly the teachers called every student inside and initiated a lockdown, and I pointed towards the man on the fence and the police were called. I was asked by the police and multiple teachers what we'd spoken about and why I hadn't immediately run away to tell someone. I told them he didn't seem dangerous to me and he just looked like he wanted help. I got a long lecture from my school and the police to never talk to anyone like that again, and especially not to tell them which school I went to. I'm not sure what happened afterwards, but I did overhear the police saying that he'd smelled of alcohol and just seemed to be wandering around. He didn't threaten me once, nor did he try and climb over the fence. He didn't seem like he wanted to hurt me or anyone, but you never know. I was escorted home by police after school that day, instead of walking, in case I was followed home. It's maybe not the scariest of encounters, but in hindsight, it could have gone very wrong very quickly. What if he'd wanted to stalk me? What if he'd climbed over the fence and tried to hurt me? He could have done any number of things to me, and I would have been helpless. I guess I got lucky, but I never hung around that area of the schoolyard again. This happened to me in 2010 when I was a college student at school in a big city, which unfortunately wasn't in the best part of town. At the time I was living in an off-campus apartment that didn't have dedicated parking spots, so I always tried to park my car along either side of the building, under a streetlight. However, on this particular day, I was only able to get a spot on the street behind the building. Around midnight, I left my apartment to drive to my then boyfriend's house in another part of the city. He was a musician and was just getting home from a gig, hence the late night meetup. I hated being outside in the city alone at night, but I hadn't seen my boyfriend in a while and thought I could quickly make it to my car without issue. To get from my apartment to my car, I had to walk out the front door of my building, turn the corner, walk alongside the building, which was the length and width of a city block, and turn down the back street where my car was parked. All in all, this should have taken no more than a couple of minutes. As I turned the corner, though, to walk alongside my apartment building, I saw a man walking directly towards me. He immediately started calling out to me and saying, "Hey, hey!" And he was far enough up the street that I thought I could make it to my car before he made it to me, so I quickened my pace, but so did he. He kept calling out to me and saying, "Hey, can you help me? I'm homeless and I need to get home." Obviously that made no sense, and the closer he got, the more I could tell that he was drunk, on drugs, or both. He was getting closer and closer to me, all the while calling out to me and asking for money to get home, when I suddenly realized that I couldn't make it to my car before he would make it to me. So I stopped dead in my tracks underneath the street light on the side of the building. I always walked with my keys in hand, so I would never be stuck digging around for them at an inopportune time, much like this one. And thanks to my mum making sure I was always safe in the city, my keys were complete with a keychain of mace. By that time, the guy was a foot away from me, aggressively asking for money and telling me he needed to get home. I told him I had no money and couldn't help him, but he moved closer until he was inches away from me. So I picked up my mace, and in that moment the streetlight shone on it perfectly, so this creep saw it and backed away. To this day I swear I had a guardian angel watching over me. This guy could have grabbed me, snatched my purse, or gotten violent, yet the mere sight of my mace was thankfully enough to spook him. He quickly walked past me down the street, and I sprinted to my car and sped away, shaking. Needless to say, I never ever walked to my car alone at night again. One of the most frustrating parts of this encounter is that it happened within sight of a city surveillance camera that wasn't functioning. A few months prior to this incident, someone tried to break into my car, and when I called the police and asked them to review the surveillance, they told me the camera in that area didn't work and hadn't done for a long time. So I know there was no way this guy would have been caught either, which kept me constantly on edge, so much so that I moved out of the city entirely a few months later. The job that I, a 26-year-old female, used to work at was located downtown on Main Street, and to date it's been the best job I've ever had, and I absolutely loved it. But I often didn't get off until after 11 p.m, and as you might imagine, weird things happen downtown that late at night. A couple of years ago, I got off work and had to walk a block to get to the parking garage where I had left my car. I usually tried to park on the street, but it wasn't uncommon for there to be no available spots. So I had parked in this garage a million times over and never had anything alarming happen. It's well maintained, well lit, and attached to the police station, so minimal weirdness. Ordinarily I parked on the floor that connected to a side entrance, so that I could walk out directly onto the street and avoid the stairwell and elevator. But that night, for whatever reason, I didn't do that. I was walking to my car that was parked in the first row by the stairwell, when I heard someone else open the door behind me. I peeked over my shoulder to see who it was, and was mollified when I saw it was a mild-looking guy about my age. He had a hiking backpack and some kind of sports equipment, I think. My memory is a little foggy. He wasn't paying me any attention, and was making a beeline for a car several spaces down from mine, already pulling out his keys and generally minding his business. Cool. I turned back to my car and started unlocking the door, and I half sat in the driver's seat so that I could throw all my stuff to the passenger side, vaguely aware of the sound of the guy also unlocking his car and opening his door. Then once my stuff was settled, I moved so that I was sitting down all the way. Then I closed and locked the door and went to put my key in the ignition, when I became painfully aware of how quiet it was. It's so interesting how the human brain works on a subconscious level. I had pretty much entirely dismissed the guy after I deemed him just a dude, but some part of my brain was still keeping track of him, without me even consciously thinking about it. I realized that I should have heard his car door close by then, so I looked up out of my window, and I made direct eye contact with him, because he was staring right at me. He was standing in the space between his open door and the car body, his face completely turned towards me, not moving, just staring. I immediately thought, no, and started my car. I was so terrified that he was going to approach as I was reversing out of my spot, or that he was going to get in his car and follow me, but he didn't do either, thankfully. I was super paranoid that I was going to run into him in the parking garage, or even that he was going to show up at my work, and it was a long time before I stopped looking at him. I generally prefer to err on the side of overly cautious, and tend to be suspicious of other people, especially at night, especially when I'm alone, and especially when I'm isolated. And honestly, this is even more true when it comes to men. This guy just totally passed the vibe check, until he didn't. Maybe he was staring because he'd recognized me from where I worked. Maybe he was staring because he thought I was pretty. Maybe he was staring because he was a tired college student who just happened to space out at the wrong time. I don't know, and I never will. But thanks. I hated it. My mum at the time was working 40 to 50 hours a week, so whilst on vacation from school, I was responsible for watching my younger sister. I was a high school junior at the time, and I had babysitting experience, so I decided why not. I didn't get paid to watch my little sister, but she was a relatively good kid, so it wouldn't be a hassle. Before my mum went to work, she gave me the normal rules and told me to make sure I keep an eye on my little sister. I shrugged her off and sat on the couch to watch some TV. Then she raced down the stairs 15 minutes later and asked me if she could go next door to collect some old dolls that the neighbour had promised her. It was a sweet old lady who was about 65 and had grandkids that were me and my sister's age. I said yes, and to be back in 5 minutes, to which she put on her sandals to go out. At this time, my sister had a habit of leaving the door open, but I didn't mind most of the time, because it was hot and we lived in a safe public neighbourhood. There was slim to no crime, and everyone knew everyone else. So with that being said, if you do something bad, your parents would know about it within the hour. I know you're reading this and thinking how dumb it was to leave the door open, but like I said, we lived in a public place. Then whilst my sister was next door, I decided to use the restroom. We have 2 bathrooms, one half bathroom downstairs for guests, and one full one upstairs for us. So while I was in the bathroom downstairs, I could hear my sister slamming the door closed and walking up the stairs to her room. I finished up, flushed and washed my hands, then sat back on the couch to watch TV, curious as to what my sister got. I called her name, but there was no answer, just a muffled rustling of toys. I decided to leave her alone and turn my attention back to the TV, and I was so into the show I was watching, I didn't notice my little sister standing across from me. It didn't click for me that I hadn't heard her come downstairs. I just stared at her, annoyed that she kept staring at me. I paused the TV and asked her what she wanted, and she looked at me wide-eyed and told me someone was upstairs. I laughed at her and said that wasn't funny, but I could see she was still visibly scared. I thought she was joking and asked if she'd come back from home a few minutes ago, and she said no. She said the door was closed and pointed to the disregarded box of dolls by the back door. Walking into the kitchen, I called my dad to come over, then grabbed a big knife from the kitchen drawer. Making my way back into the living room, I told my sister to go into the bathroom and lock the door behind her, and told her not to open it until I told her Mum was home, so she would know it was me. I crept up the stairs and peeked into each room, until I got to my little sister's door. It cracked open, and toys and clothes now littered her normally organised room. But I didn't wait. I kicked open the door and flicked on the light, and my blood ran cold. In my little sister's rocking chair sat a little old woman, rocking back and forth with a plastic baby doll. I stepped further into the room and demanded she get the hell out of my house, even though I wasn't raised to curse at adults, but this was a strange woman in my little sister's bedroom. She stopped rocking and started to hum the tune to a baby lullaby, and the most terrifying part wasn't that she was pretending that the baby was real. It was the unnatural smile that was stretched across her wrinkled face. She stood up and giggled on the way out and down the stairs, as I stood there staring at her room, trying to see if anything was missing. I didn't even notice that she'd taken the doll with her. I walked back downstairs and checked before letting my little sister know she could come out after I'd locked the doors, and by then my dad was pulling up in the driveway, and I told him what had just happened. He walked around and checked the rooms like I had, and whilst he was upstairs, my little sister told me that the old lady knew where she had been and had tried to get her to come with her. The creepiest part, though, was when my sister told me she'd sounded like she was attempting to sound like me. But when she didn't say Mum's home, she stepped away from the door. A long time ago, I went to church camp, and I was maybe 13 to 14 at the time. I can't remember the year exactly, but I was old enough that the girls and the boys were flirting with each other. Now, like many places in the US, we lived in a suburb that was only 2 to 3 hours away from beautiful woods and camping areas, and this church camp was no exception. It had some big facilities and also hosted other groups, and I'd been there with my Girl Scout troop before. Many different churches would have camped there at the same time as ours, as it was sort of like a getaway for Sunday school kids of the same ages. The first night was weird, because we'd noticed there was a bat in our room in one of the large dorms, so me and the other girls in our church group had to sleep in the downstairs of the dorm. I was so scared I would have rather have slept with the bat than in that crappy room with all the shadows and creaking floors, but that problem was quickly solved by the next night. The next day we started the typical activities. We'd had some little mini seminars out in the yard when I noticed a girl that no one was talking to. She had long frizzy hair and wore some outdated clothing, and I'm the kind of person who felt bad for anyone, and I saw she was reading a book, so I wanted to be her friend. I sat down next to her and started chatting, and we ended up getting along. She didn't get my jokes about pop culture though, but I just chalked it up to her being homeschooled, like she said she was. We hung out for 2 days and no one bothered us at all. But then at the end of the second day, she told me she had to go home all of a sudden. She explained that she wasn't here for the church camp, but that her dad was a pastor and that he said it was time to go. I thought it was kind of strange, but I was more sad to be losing out on a good friend. I asked her if we could be pen pals. She said she didn't have the internet or anything at home, but she said her dad wouldn't let her. I was heartbroken. The girl said that she wanted to say goodbye, and she wanted to spend as much time with me as possible, so I followed her to the house on the camp where her family was staying. It was a finishing house in the middle of the camp, and we went inside, but there was no one else there. She led me to a room with 3 beds and told me she had to get ready for bed before her father returned. I said okay and sat down on the edge of one of the beds, looking through some of her books that were all older publishings, but still books I enjoyed. They matched the interior of the house, kind of like 70s-ish. She then came out in a long white nightdress and began to lotion her hands with some thick cream she had in a tub next to her bed. She then put on a pair of leather white gloves, and I asked her what she was doing. "Moisturizing," she said. I giggled and said I would miss her, and she gave me a hug. Then I left her room, the house, and sat outside feeling sad that I wouldn't see my friend again. When I asked a few people around the camp about her and her family, no one knew what I was talking about, or who I was describing. I didn't look too much into it at the time, but now when I think about it, no one else had talked to her when we were together. I had been mad about that at the time, but now I think about it, she might not even have been there at all. I miss her as she was sweet and smart and kind, and I had enjoyed talking to her for those 2 days. In the summer of 2019, my partner and I, both in our early 20s, had decided to take a road trip to Vancouver, Canada, and stay at Golden Ears Provincial Park. We liked camping, had spring break, and wanted to do something different to make the most of our vacation. My partner had never been out of the US, so it seemed like a crazy new experience for them. It was a 6-day trip with Airbnbs in each state, and the grand finale was a reserved campsite at Golden Ears, which was close to the water, Alouette Lake. We packed terribly. We had a giant tent, brought a bunch of fruit and veggies to eat healthily, stored them in a cooler that was too small, and brought a cutting board and knife to break up the snacks whilst driving. We started in California, driving our bright red Ford Fiesta, then drove through Oregon and Washington, finally making it to Vancouver. We spent a day or 2 in each state, drank a little too much and stayed out late, and it was great. Canada was the best part, and Alouette Lake felt like walking in a painting. We walked barefoot on the rocks with our toes in the freezing cold water. We hiked around and saw a beautiful waterfall where we saw a couple taking pictures of each other. We were there for an hour and we started modeling the same poses from far away, and everything was perfect. The campsite was also empty, which was awesome, except for the other couple. We went to bed early that night and it was quiet. Then I woke up to crackling outside the tent. My partner was still asleep and snoring, so I didn't think much of it because it was pitch black and probably an animal. But the crackling continued closer to the tent. I sat up and grabbed my phone, causing it to light up, so I turned it off as was almost blinded by the light. In those 2 seconds I could make out a person right outside our tent, and I froze and sat up to see that they weren't moving and were close enough to unzip the tent. I started poking my partner because I had no idea what to do. They woke up and I told them there was someone outside the tent. Then I heard quiet footsteps walking out of our campsite. My partner started loudly saying, "What?" repeatedly in a sleepy haze. A car or truck was parked right outside our camping area, and it started up and drove off. They didn't turn their lights on until they'd turned the corner and we were out of view, so I couldn't make out much, but it looked like a truck. I was shaking now, and my partner couldn't put together what was happening. I wanted to leave, but Golden Ears locks the gates until 6 or 7 a.m, and it was only 1, so we were stuck. I made us move to the Fiesta, and we slept in the tightly packed car. She fell asleep immediately, and thought I was just paranoid. Could it have been a park ranger? It seemed too weird of behavior for that. I sat there awake for about 2 hours then. The car was locked and I wanted to sleep, but I just couldn't. I was in the passenger seat and my partner in the driver's seat asleep, and it was now 3 a.m. I was sitting half awake when I suddenly heard a car slowly drive up the road with its lights off as it rounded the corner. It had to be the same truck, and I was scared. But my adrenaline was pumping. It slowly rounded the corner and pulled up directly in front of our campsite, again in the same spot. I felt like I was going to throw up. I had no weapon but the kitchen knife we'd brought for the fruit and veggies, so I grabbed the knife and tried and made myself look angry, crazy and big. I sat straight up in the passenger seat, holding the kitchen knife, keeping it straight up at eye level, and stared deadpan out at this truck in the pitch black, just like the father in the American Gothic painting. The truck stopped and turned off, and a light shone directly into my face, coming from inside the truck. I stared back terrified from my bright red Ford Fiesta and holding my large kitchen knife, not blinking. The truck started up again then and turned on its lights this time. They stayed on, blinding me, and the truck pulled out, turned around and went back from where it had come. My heart was pounding, and I woke up my partner, saying we needed to get the hell out of there. We packed up by just throwing things into our car and sat there awake until 6 a.m. Then we drove home and didn't stop, trying to make sense of the situation. We ultimately decided that we both needed some sleep, though. This isn't a terrifying thing that happened to me, and honestly it could have been worse, but it all went down in a matter of minutes. So for some background, I'm a 13-year-old female, and I live in a pretty small town where I grew up, so basically everyone knows each other. It wouldn't be weird to start up a conversation with someone whilst out walking, and my mum is also pretty well known around the town, because she's a nurse at the clinic and has a cleaning business. My puppy is 3 months old, and he also loves people, so he'll run up to anyone and start licking them. Now the story I'm about to tell you only happened around 4 hours ago, and I just can't get over how weird the whole thing was. It started when my sister, who's 18, and I went out to clean the public toilets in the town, as we work for our mum, and we took our mum's cleaning van. Once we'd finished, we went for a quick drive to get out of the house, and it was by now around 6:30 p.m. We noticed a guy walking down the street, and neither my sister or myself recognized him, so when he waved, we were kind of confused. We went around the block again and got another wave, but we just brushed it off and assumed he knew our mum and went home. Later on, around 7:30 p.m, my puppy, who wasn't toilet trained, came outside with me whilst I was watering the lawn, so he could empty his little tank. And as I watered the lawn, I flicked the footpath just slightly with the hose, and the same guy from earlier, who I'll call Mr. Waver from now on, walked around the corner. Now I couldn't see around the corner because there was this huge plant in the way, so I wasn't intentionally trying to hit him. Then the following conversation went like this. "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to wet you," I said, but I hadn't wet him at all. "Sorry, miss," he replied. Then the puppy took off out of the gate after him and started licking his legs, so I left the safety of my front yard and went for the puppy. Now me and Mr. Waver were standing the appropriate 1.5 meters away from each other, with puppy dog at his legs. "Oh, what's his name?" he asked. "Rufus, and he likes people," I said. "Oh, good puppy. I like these puppies." "We saw you earlier when we were driving around. Do you know my mum?" I suddenly asked. "Francis. Do you know Francis?" he said. Confused, I replied, "What? No. No, I guess you wouldn't know him." Then he started talking about something to do with a picture whilst standing with his arms in front of him, like he was about to get his mugshot taken. The puppy was now licking his leg again, and I was just confused as all heck. "Oh, he's a good puppy. I like puppies like this," he then said. "Yeah, he does like to bite though," I warned, and showed bites and scratch marks on my leg. "Oh, how come? He's a good puppy." "Yeah, he can be," I said. "You know he can smell my dick," Mr. Waver said. "Excuse me?" I thought I'd misheard him. He can smell my dick and he'll suck it as well. This guy then proceeded to grab my poor baby and hold his nose against his crotch. Yeah, he'll suck it. Really disturbed, now I said, "Okay, puppy needs to go inside now." Then I grabbed my dog and tried to walk away as fast as possible without seeming rude, and he yelled to me, "Can I come too?" "No, sorry, no." What the hell? I then just walked inside, locked both locks, and told my sisters, brother, and my mum what had just happened. They told me that they could see me in the cameras, but just me. And because it was night, they just assumed I was following my puppy because he usually runs out the gate. My sister and brother, both 6 foot tall, were ready to go after him, but were quickly shut down by our mother. So besides my heart pounding out of my chest for another half an hour before I calmed down, it was pretty much forgotten about, with a few comments made here and there. The scariest part was that this guy was easily around 22 to 25, and he also continuously lifted his shirt up, even when I went to lift up the puppy. He lifted his shirt up, and it kind of seemed like he was hinting towards something. It was more than likely that he was drunk or high, because in this town it's common to find people getting high off petrol, or even deodorant, especially the younger ones. So thank you to this guy that knows my name and where I live for making me feel unsafe. Update. My mum went over to the school this morning around 6 to open up the toilets and blow down the basketball courts, and ran into none other than Mr. Waver. Him and a lady were there asking for someone called David and Troy, as we only know one person called Troy and he doesn't know who Mr. Waver is. Mum said his behaviour was just creepy, and he kept stepping closer, somewhat trying to reach for the keys around her neck. The lady that was with him was also mouthing the words, "I don't know him." But after asking around, they are together, we're just not sure if they're married or not. Mum eventually went and got a few teachers to speak with them, then just left. Once she'd gotten home and I woke up, she asked for the description of Mr. Waver, and sure enough it was definitely him. We're almost sure it's a mental illness, but we aren't worried too much. We'll just keep our distance. Not sure if this is creepy to anyone else, but it sure did spook my friends and I. One day my friend told me she had some news she wanted to tell. She was pregnant, so I assumed it was something about the baby. Her and her boyfriend, who is also my best friend, picked me up and we went to get some food. For some context, we live in a very big city and usually go to the inner parts to get some tacos. The neighborhood is pretty ghetto, but not altogether dangerous, and we're used to eating around there, so it's nothing we thought twice about. We pulled into a parking lot that was really busy, and the taco spot we went to was on the street corner and was pretty popular. My guy friend asked us what we wanted, and that he was going to get the food and leave me and his girlfriend in the car so we could talk. I assumed it was something serious, as we usually stick together, so she proceeded to vent to me that she'd had a miscarriage and that she felt pretty sad about it. She was really happy she was going to be having a child. Now keep in mind that the parking lot was filled with cars, but most of the cars were either empty or had people eating inside of them. But there was a parking spot that was empty right next to us. As I began to comfort my friend and tell her about how sorry I was for her, we noticed what seemed to be a pretty new Mercedes pull up next to us. We thought nothing of it, continued our conversation, and saw a man get out of the car. He seemed to be dressed similarly to Johnny Depp in the movie Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. As my friend continued, this random guy, who not but 2 seconds ago just parked next to us, began to knock on our window. Being from the city and having to deal with random crackheads and strangers pretty often, my friend and I just told him to go away and that we didn't have any money, even though the guy looked like he had money. Then just as we told him to go away, he started speaking to us in Spanish, saying, "Y el bebé?" meaning, and the baby? My friend and I glanced at each other in complete confusion, not knowing how this man knew the subject of our conversation. We had tinted windows too, so he couldn't really see us as it was in the late evening, but then began to cup his hands and put them to the window so he could see inside of the car. My friend was literally staring at him as he continued to ask us questions like, "Where is the baby?" and "How is the baby?" in Spanish. My friend and I were really confused by this point, and she just looked at me with a dumbfounded look that I've never seen from her before. She told him to go F himself in Spanish, and as she started cursing him, he tried to open the door. Thank goodness they were locked. Just as I was about to head to the door to unlock it, so I could confront him face to face, my friend held me back and said, "Wait, I think there's something wrong with him." Now I'm about 5'10", 22 years old, and I weighed about 200 pounds. And the guy was about 5'6" and middle-aged, so I knew I could have taken him. But just as my friend was trying to hold me back, my guy friend came back with the tacos in his hand. He's about 6'2" and weighs about 230, and being that my friends and I are punks, we obviously dressed a certain way, and some people get intimidated by that. The guy that was trying to open the door seemed to have gotten intimidated by my massive friend, and just got in his car and drove off, as my friend looked on in confusion about what had just happened. He got in the car and we told him what had happened. His girlfriend and I have played pranks on him in the past though, just to mess with him, so he was a little skeptic about whether we were telling the truth or not. He told us that maybe the guy overheard our conversation and was on crack and started to ask us random questions about the baby, because that's what we were talking about. But she explained to him that that was impossible, because the second that he'd parked, he'd got out of his car and started to knock on our door, asking us about a baby. My friend and I couldn't have been talking that loudly for him to hear our conversation. And not only that, but she wanted to talk about something else, so she could stop crying about her miscarriage. So there was absolutely no way that that guy could have heard us talking about her baby. Now that my girlfriend was more visibly upset, her boyfriend started to believe us, and said that maybe the guy was confusing us for someone else. We sat there for a bit trying to figure out how it was possible that this random man came out of nowhere and automatically started talking about a baby. Coincidence? Possibly. But it was definitely a weird night for all of us, and we started to head home. Now I don't usually scare easily, but the situation did shake me up a bit, and my head started to race with thoughts of every possible situation. I know this might not be inherently creepy, but I still wonder to this day about that night. How could he have known about my friend's miscarriage? Why pull up to the parking lot and go crazy on us for no reason, trying to look for a baby, and just drive away as if nothing happened? About a year passed since this incident, and me and my two friends still talk about it to this day. We never saw that man again, but needless to say, we never went back to that taco spot again either, even though the tacos were really good. So to preface this, I would like to state that this story is probably going to read like the plot of a campy 1980s horror movie. However, this entire story is 100% true, and if not for being 5 miles from cell reception and the way the story ends, there would be a police report for verification. So a buddy of mine tried to camp twice a month, now that I have a vehicle that can be trusted to get me to some of the more remote areas of our state, and we'd planned a camping trip for this past weekend. We chose a fairly remote location we had been to the previous weekend, and that time we were the only people we'd seen within 1 mile of our camp spot. Friday night we got there and set up, but the story takes place the following Saturday night. It was about 9 p.m, so the sun was long gone, and the moon hadn't quite risen yet, so it was pitch black out, other than what light our fire was giving off, when suddenly we heard a man screaming. We listened intently, silently sharing an anxious look, and at first we were hoping it was some drunk person having a little too much fun. But it quickly became obvious that that wasn't the case. It wasn't even like he was hurt. It sounded more full of despair, anger, and anguish. I'm going to take a moment to remind you that this was 9 p.m, pitch black night, in the middle of nowhere woods 5 miles from the nearest cell phone signal, and we hadn't seen anyone in hours. The screaming continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a solid 5 minutes. But we had no idea what to make of it, and started feeling extremely paranoid. We gathered up anything remotely close to a weapon, and tried to come up with some explanations, whilst keeping our eyes on the forest around us. After around 15 tense minutes of fear-induced paranoia, I nearly fell out of my seat as I watched a flashlight and lantern slowly enter our camp. I greeted the stranger with a basic, "How's it going?" before his appearance was lit up by the fire. He responded quickly but flatly by asking if we could do him a favour. "That depends on the favour," my buddy and I said in unison, obviously tense and holding our weapons close to us. The stranger proceeded to ask if he could hang out for a second by the fire. Now, given there was 2 of us and 1 of him, plus our myriad of weapons gathered from around the camp to within arm's reach, we decided to agree and let him hang out. He sat down, then after a short second of awkward silence, I asked him what the hell was going on. He proceeded to tell my buddy and I that he was camping down the trail with his friend, but the friend had snapped and tried to kill him. "Wait, what?" I said before the thought even finished processing in my mind. "Is that the screaming we heard earlier?" The man slowly nodded, staring blankly into the fire, then began his story. "We were just hanging out. We'd come up earlier today, and my buddy just freaked out. He started screaming and just wouldn't stop. Then he attacked me, lunging at me. I told him to just back off and chill, but he kept coming after me, and he started getting really violent, and I'm pretty sure he was going to kill me. So I grabbed my car keys, the lights, and ran. I don't know what to do, man. He chased me when I ran, and I don't know what to do. We don't have firearms or anything, but we do have a hatchet." My buddy and I looked at each other for a second, completely astonished. Then something horrible dawned on me. "Wait, he chased you? Like, he's on his way here, right now?" The man just slowly nodded in reply, and right on cue, like some terrible horror movie come to life, we heard screaming from maybe 30 to 40 feet from our camp down on the main trail. He was screaming for Gary, telling him he wanted his balance, and asking where he was. I'd never in my life heard a man scream like this, and it was a brutal, guttural scream that was shrill to the ears yet deep in pitch, the sound of someone that had gone completely mad. And the way he said the stranger's name would switch erratically from long and sing-songy to short, guttural punches of sound. We killed our lights, became silent and listened, and by some miracle, the madman didn't notice our camp and continued walking down the trail, screaming the whole way. We ended up chatting with who we'll call Gary for hours, listening to the screaming getting further and further away. We came to find out that they'd taken 4.5 to 5 grams of magic mushrooms each, and his buddy, who we'll call Ty, was a co-worker of his and was fine for 3.5 hours, until he suddenly snapped. It seemed as though Ty thought he could kill Gary and steal his good trip. We heard the screams still getting further and further away for over 2 hours, and by this time it was 11 p.m, and the moon was starting to come out. It was below 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and Ty had no jacket or flashlight according to Gary. My buddy and I were way too drunk to drive out of the camp to get a cell service, as it was snowy and icy and required 2 to 3 miles of highway driving after getting off the trail. And Gary was still lightly feeling the effects of weed and mushrooms, so he couldn't drive either. We had to make the decision to let the guy wander, hoping he'd sober up and would be able to find his way back. And he did, right into our camp. We heard yelling after about an hour of no screams, maybe 30 to 50 feet from camp again. "Hey, help! Please help me, I'm lost!" And we can tell the man was walking from the woods into our camp. We told Gary to hide just in case, and greeted the man, me carrying my 12-gauge shotgun and my 40 cal pistol holstered, and my buddy was carrying his AK-47 style rifle and his two 9mm Glocks holstered. And with our flashlights on our brightest settings, we directed them to his face. He was about 6'2", 6'3", and approximately 300 pounds. We talked to him and decided he was calm enough to walk with, and walked him back to his camp. He seemed really remorseful, saying he'd blacked out and didn't remember a thing, except having a falling out with his buddy. We escorted him back to his camp down the trail, returned and told Gary that Ty seemed cool, and if anything else happened to scream and come running, we would come out and help him. It ended up being a happy ending, and we made friends with Gary. I got his phone number to make sure the next day he'd gotten back into town safely, back to his wife and kid, and we were actually planning a camping trip with him soon. But Ty, who wandered screaming like a deranged maniac into the forest, potentially wielding a hatchet to murder your friend to steal his good trip, or whatever it is your psychosis-filled mind was thinking, for the love of God, don't take mushrooms again. I have posted a few creepy encounters before, but my wife had just reminded me of an incident we had back in 2017 when we were working in Utah. It happened late in November of that year and was a weekday. I was 33 years old and we had been working for a family on a ranch for about 4 years who had become like our second family. We were on work visas from South Africa, so not native to the US, but we were pretty familiar with everything, as we had been in the area for the full 4 years we'd worked for them. We decided to make the career and life change after I'd gotten burnt out at 29 years old in a corporate marketing career that wasn't going anywhere and was stealing my soul and will to live. So we just wanted to scale down and have a more relaxing lifestyle. The ranch was in North Utah, somewhere between Salt Lake City and Logan. We were almost getting ready to return to South Africa at that stage, as our visas were running out, but we wanted a bit of a holiday, as it had been a busy year, what with getting married and having our daughter, etc. So we wanted to do a bit of sightseeing before we returned, and the owner offered to pay for it. They wanted to pay for accommodation, provide spending money, and lend us his truck if we would just run an errand for him on the way. He had a couple of horses and a trailer that needed to be picked up from a ranch somewhere in Wyoming, with Cheyenne being the closest big city, more than an hour away. We jumped at the opportunity as we'd basically had a week to get there, and then a day to get back to his ranch. We visited some awesome places: Park City, Flaming Gorge, Bear Lake, Yellowstone, and Teton Village, etc. The whole trip was an amazing experience, except for the incidents this story is about, which put a bit of a dampener on the whole thing. We drove up to Park City the first day and spent the night with some friends. The incident happened on the second day of the trip, on the way between Flaming Gorge Reservoir and Bear Lake, via Green River. We were driving and enjoying the scenery, and had just crossed over the Utah-Wyoming border, when we spotted the only vehicle we'd seen for the past 30-odd miles. It was an old red-brown pickup truck that was parked on the opposite side of the road, and 2 guys were sitting inside. When we were about 150 feet from them, they pulled into the road to make a U-turn, and I was pretty pissed at this, as I was doing about 80 at the time, and had to make a hard brake and swerve into oncoming traffic to avoid having an accident with them. I punched on the horn and flipped the middle finger out the window when I passed them. They sped up then, flashing their lights behind me, but I just punched it and left them behind. I was driving my employer's new Ram 2500 diesel truck, so it had no shortage of power to get away. A few miles down the road and I couldn't see them behind me anymore, so I assumed they just turned off. But then probably about 40 to 50 miles up the road, we pulled into Little America to get diesel and some food, but when we came out of the shop, we saw that the truck was parked across the lot, but no one was in it. We decided to load up and head out, as I wasn't in the mood for an argument with some redneck cowboys. so we headed out and thought that was the last we'd seen of them. But boy, were we wrong. We were looking for interesting places to stop and things to see en route, and about 45 minutes or so after we'd left Little America, we spotted a sign that pointed to Fossil Butte National Monument. We pulled in and literally had the place to ourselves, being the only car in the parking lot. We walked around but couldn't see much as it was closed, so we decided to head out. But right as we got to the truck, we spotted the red pickup speeding into the lot. I panicked now, and my wife jumped into the back with our 5-month-old daughter. I ran around and jumped into the driver's seat, and right as I wanted to pull out, the pickup pulled in behind us, blocking us from exiting. I was shitting bricks by this point, screaming at my wife to call 911. The two guys jumped out of the truck and started running towards us, one on each side of the truck. Only then did I notice that both of them had their faces covered by what looked like handkerchiefs, like what cowboys usually wear around their necks. Right at this time as well, my wife said in a panic that she didn't have any cell service. I was having to make split-second decisions and noticed that except for the curb and a signpost off to the left, there was nothing really solid in front of the truck. So I threw the truck into drive, swung the steering to the right and floored it. The truck bounced over the curb, ploughed through the sagebrush, and made a wide turn through the field, back towards the parking area, and we raced for the exit. We had been parked at the far end of the lot, and were now going through it the wrong way to get out. The other guys were back in their truck now, racing to cut us off, and they beat us to the entrance as they had a much shorter distance to cover than we did. They proceeded to park their truck sideways across the road by the gate, so there was no way we could get around it without causing some serious damage to my boss's brand new truck. We stopped about 150 feet from them, and we could see that one guy had an aluminium bat and the other had some sort of bar or tire iron that he was swinging around. My wife was crying in a panic, and our daughter was now screaming, and I was shaking from adrenaline and fear. Even though the situation was still dodgy, I felt like we were out of any immediate danger. The two guys didn't move towards us. They were just standing next to their truck, staring us down. It felt like hours, but was probably less than a few minutes. Then I told my wife to buckle our daughter in and look behind the seat for the rifle my boss kept there. She found it and passed it to me. I wasn't worried about the bat and bar, but needed the rifle just in case one of them had a firearm. I didn't want to make the situation worse, of course, so was still contemplating whether I should use it if they approach or threaten us again, when I noticed a camper turning off the highway towards us. The two guys must have seen it too, as they looked at each other, got in their truck and sped off, and they turned the way we'd come from onto the highway, and when we could no longer see them, we started driving. We passed the camper and the old couple gave us a friendly wave, wondering if they knew that to us they were the angels sent from heaven that day. The story ends pretty anticlimactically. We had a pretty amazing but uneventful, at least if you count dodgy encounters, rest of the trip. We told my boss what happened when we returned, and his explanation was that they probably were looking for trouble. That's why they'd cut us off with the U-turn. And then when people react, they start a confrontation. It sounded plausible at the time. That is until about a week later when we were already back in South Africa. I was lying in bed thinking over the encounter when it struck me. From where we'd first encountered them, when they cut us off with the U-turn, the Fossil Butte Visitor Center was over 3 hours and close to about 120 miles. You don't follow someone that far unless you have sinister intentions, so they must have purposely followed us, as there were many different routes that they could have taken that would have led them away from us, and we turned off the interstate and made about 2 or 3 other turns since leaving Little America. That made me lie awake for a few more hours, wondering what their intentions were, and what would have happened if that old couple with the camper hadn't turned off right when they did. Years ago, I dated a man who owned a bar where I worked. and one night we closed up and were leaving around 3 a.m. We were parked next to each other, and as soon as he opened his door, he discovered a man was asleep in the back seat. We tried to wake him and check that he was okay, and eventually decided he was just trying to sleep it off, so we appreciated that he hadn't driven, even if it was weird to choose someone else's car. We were just glad a customer of ours hadn't hurt anyone. So the boyfriend suggested we go in my car, go out to breakfast at an all-night diner, then come back, assuming he could wake the guy by then and give him a ride wherever he needed to go. So we went to breakfast, took a good long time hanging out, and went back to the car close to sunrise. But the man still wouldn't wake up. I frankly just wanted to call the police, but the boyfriend still didn't want to get the guy in trouble, so he decided he was just going to bring his car home with the man in it, and he could just get out whenever he felt like it. In retrospect, this plan seems even dumber than I found it at the time. Well, where we happened to live was a downtown apartment that is very close to the police station, and we parked in an alley behind our apartment that backed up to the side door of the PD. So we went home as usual, and the guy was gone when we got up. The very next evening, this man showed up at the bar again. One would think he'd take a night off, but no. Since he was obviously okay and no harm had come to him, I thought the whole thing was funny, and thought he'd find it funny too. So as I served him, I said, "Hey, you're the guy that was asleep in my boyfriend's car," with a big smile on my face. The smile dropped off this guy's face though, and he looked absolutely livid. He snarled, "Are you the bitch who left me at the police department? You think you're funny, bitch?" Then he lunged across the bar, grabbing for me. The place was crawling with bouncers, so they got him and hauled him out before he could get to me. But it scared me to death. I hope he won a ride to jail that night. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.